So my name is Brian Crane. I've been a wargame player for 45 years, and I've been a wargame designer for about 30 years. I started to design games on contemporary conflict way back when, especially games on insurgencies, guerrilla warfare, and other uh, topics in irregular warfare, whatever you want to call it. Because no one was publishing the kind of war games that I wanted to play. So I wanted to, in a sense, be the change in the industry that I wanted to see. But I've also done, over the years, a number of games on large-scale kinetic conflict. And lately, I've also been designing some simpler games on aspects of urban operations along all points of continuum of conflict. So as Matthew said, I'm here at the invitation of the Army Mad Scientist people on the strength of my submission to the Calling All Wargamers invitation that ran on the Mad Scientist blog. In it, I talked about how many commercially published civilian market war games neglect some of the critical aspects of operations, use of time and space, correlation of forces, limited intelligence, deception, and above all, logistics, for the sake of ease of play and fun. We've already touched on this topic. We've touched on this failing numerous times this morning. So I now have a feeling, as I struggle to master my imposter syndrome attack, that maybe I won't be telling everyone in this room anything that's genuinely new, because we've got a room full of professionals with very esoteric expertise. But I'm still here, and to give my answer or my reaction to the short question, how is the civilian wargaming community grappling with the changing character of current warfare? And the short answer to me is, in the immediate and narrow sense, it generally isn't, and it can't be counted on to. But you know what? That's all right. In a broader context, the mechanics and processes that we use in civilian games, both war and non-war games, have contributed usefully in many ways to professional wargaming world. And I think it will do a lot more along these lines, and indirectly will help enterprising designers in both professional and civilian worlds to understand and model the current operational environment in the world they inhabit. So that is what I would like to talk about. I'd also like to start by explicitly limiting my remarks as much as possible to board or manual war games, which is where my direct experience lies. Tomorrow we'll be talking a lot more about the technical and computerized aspect of things, but I'm going to be talking about what's called the analog world. And also on my last slide, I will have a link to where you can get the script and slides for my presentation, so you don't have to take notes. So that's what you're going to do. Next, I'd like to use the term civilian war games in partial distinction from the term commercial, because they're not quite interchangeable. Yes, the goal of a lot of designers is to get their work produced and distributed in large numbers by a publishing company. And the main customer demographic of these companies is, of course, other civilians. But this doesn't acknowledge the home truth about this very small and, in the great scheme of things, very niche hobby, that no one, or almost no one, makes their daily bread by designing war games for the hobby market. They don't do it for the money. They do it for the attention and to satisfy the same basic creative urge that drives other people to write Sailor Moon fan fiction or stitch quilts, what have you. For me, designing war games is how I attempt to make sense of the world around me. It's a big, confusing, complicated world. I study certain aspects of it. I build models of it, and I try to share my understanding of world events, or not world event, but whatever it is that I'm thinking, I try to share it with the world. And it's how I try to make sense of things. That's as near as I can tell, the impulse behind my creative drive to keep doing this. Not market success, not notoriety, but to satisfy myself that I have at least a partial understanding of some parts of what's going on in the world, or what has gone on in the world. And I think the proof of this is the large amount of cheap and free or nearly free stuff out there that's self-published via desktop publishing or simply given away as print and play projects. I also want to use the term civilian to set it apart from professional. Normally, the opposite of the word professional is amateur, and it might seem to fit here in view of the non-commercial aspect I've been talking about. But the word amateur also carries this connotation of uninformed dilettante, and it doesn't respect the prodigious amount of historical research game designers often do in creating a game. And of course, there are many examples of many women here in this room who have spent considerable time in the military or were career analysts and have turned to designing games themselves or got to design games during their careers. And of course, we have students at Georgetown University among ourselves who want a career in analysis or the military and are creating their own first designs. I would not call these people uninformed dilettantes by any stretch of the imagination. And at the end of this presentation, I'll put up a slide with some links where we can see some examples of some other work. The Georgetown University Wargaming Society, a phenomenal organization that's come so far in just a few years, is a great example, but there are others out there as well. But it was an ambitious, gifted amateur who did start the hobby of civilian wargaming. His name was Charles Roberts, and in 1952, he started selling copies of a wargame he had designed by mail order from his garage. This game featured a map board and counters that represented military formations. It mimicked the look of the battle maps and map exercises that he had seen in his personal reading or had participated in as a National Guard infantry officer. He hoped that by publishing this game, that it would demonstrate and grow interest in military affairs and possibly improve his chances of obtaining a commission in the regular army. And by the time his initial print of 3,000 copies had run out, he decided to go into the printing business instead. In 1958, Charles Roberts happened to see this picture in Life magazine. These are some analysts from Rand Corporation playing a game on a hex map. He knew a good thing when he saw it, and so by 1961, he had published 5 war games himself that used the hex. And interestingly, at one point, Rand Corporation did the reverse. They contacted Roberts to ask him about the combat results table that he was using in tactics and the other war games that he had designed in the last couple of years, because it incorporated a breakpoint at 3-to-1 odds, which was an interesting example of parallel development because the gamers at Rand had been using a very similar table. Charles Roberts said much later that they must have been very disappointed to learn when he told them that he had worked his table out in about 15 minutes. When presumably, Rand had spent a lot more time and done a lot more math to arrive at the same result. Or maybe that's what they put on the invoice. I don't know. So commercial wargaming was off and running, spawning thousands of derivatives based on this interesting collision between Rand and the civilian world, featuring 2 incidences of synchronicity and minor intellectual theft. Although I thought that if anybody holds a patent on the hexagon, it's the honeybee. Matt Caffrey is a name that is familiar to many of us in this room, as not only the creator of the Connections annual conference on professional wargaming, but also as an historian of professional wargaming in the Western world. In 2000, he wrote an article where he described 3 benefits of wargaming. And while he was describing professional wargames, there are examples of where civilian games and game designers were able to contribute to these processes. Among the ones he named were personal development and mental training for members of the military. We've discussed this already. And before 2000, there were multiple examples of this. There's an old SPI game called Firefight that was meant to be a tactical trainer. The military has also used miniatures, rules, and other commercial off-the-shelf games for PME. There's also many examples of video games that have been used as trainers for individual soldiers. Also, force or doctrinal development, although there are more limited examples of this. I would offer use of games like Harpoon, a computer game called TAC Ops that was used to do some early work on what was called Team Trackless, or the idea of wheeled BCP back when the Striker was a new vehicle. And finally, strategy development. There's even more limited examples there, but they do exist. And the anecdote is often told of how Mark Herman's game Gulf Strike was used by planners in the Pentagon at the beginning of the, soon after the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, because there weren't any professional games ready to go. Talk about trouble in the Persian Gulf. So that's great. But there are definite limitations on what civilian games have to offer the professional world. And the most obvious one, and we've discussed this already, is the expectation that a civilian war game must be fun or balanced somehow. Sitting down to play one of these games is a volitional activity, and it vies for your attention with a lot of other potential diversions. So the game, to be successful, to attract attention, has to address issues of balance and competition between the players and provide excitement for them. But if any truly historical battle could be said to be objectively balanced, you can be assured that the combatants did not want it to be that way. Warfare, ideally, is never fair war. Another obvious limitation is detail. Lack of detail, or too much of the wrong kind of detail, or that the details are simply wrong. Civilian games, of course, have to do a great deal of violence to historical settings and historical context, and abstracting events and processes so much that the game itself can become trivial or fanciful. The important points are never made. Or instead, the designer mistakes needless detail and verisimilitude for realism, and the game mires itself in a swamp of trivial processes that don't add up to a coherent lesson. Again, here the important points might be made, but they get lost in the weeds. Civilian games also rely on open sources for their technical information. For historical games, that's okay, but for contemporary topics, thanks to the internet too, there's far greater volume of this kind of thing available now, but it may be no more reliable than before, or just as susceptible to confirmation by cut and paste repetition, exaggeration, or plain misdirection. For example, years ago, I was researching order battle detail for the Israeli Defense Forces for a hypothetical Third Lebanon war game, and I could not find consistent information on unit composition or unit locales. Apparently, this is deliberate IDF policy. A final point here is that there's not an awful lot that is being produced that is of immediate relevance and immediate benefit to a professional war game designer or analyst. After 30 years of rolling my own, I've long since come to the conclusion that while all civilian wargamers are interested in history, in general, they are no more interested in or comprehending the current events than non-wargamers. Obviously, present company, very much. I recently did a search of Board Game Geek, which I know is not an infallible resource, but it's a generally okay guide to what's going on in civilian market games. Between 2020 and 25, that's the last 5 years. So over the last 5 years, I found well over 3,000 items with the tag Wargame were published and entered into the Board Game Geek database. This includes expansions, but I did limit it to games that have actual owners because, of course, there's a lot of vaporware that shows up on Board Game Geek as well. Among these thousands of items I found, at a scale higher than a tactical or skirmish level game, I found 6 games that were devoted to actual wars that have occurred after the year 2000. I found 12 games that were devoted to a hypothetical present day or near future conflict. That's 18 games among 3,000 catalog entries. And while the civilian wargame market may certainly be in an extended golden age, it is clear that the goodies are not falling in due to the contemporary world. Also, over that 5-year period, I found 24 operational scale games that were devoted to a hypothetical Cold War that went hot sometime around 1985. I mention this because, for me, it's a rather perplexing development. It's a resurgence of nostalgia fumes for a second wave of games that are on this topic. Sure, I played the first wave of these back in the day, back in the 80s, but then I laid them aside after 1990 when the hypothesis became essentially irrelevant. But I also mention these because after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I saw it seriously proposed in online forums and discussion boards I was reading that the dust should simply be blown off some old Focus-Gap games, maybe adjust a few ratings, and then use them to model the war that was shaping up in Ukraine. I mean, what's wrong with that? After all, they're still mostly Russians, right? Why should anything have changed? I found this lack of insight disturbing. So maybe I could conclude that we should just forget about it. We should forget about formal publication of meaningful contemporary period games by civilian companies that would provide new insights. Except that my talk would be over already after barely 10 minutes. And I would also be very, very wrong. I cannot be so dismissive because, scarce as they may be, there are formally published, relevant, very good exceptions, and they are seen and played and appreciated by people who matter. We spent the morning talking about these. We talked about Mitchell Land's Next War series with 6 titles, Sebastian's Littoral Commander series, and soon there will be a game coming out called Defiance from GMT. This is about the first year, just the first year of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and it's co-designed by Mark Herman, a man who's not here, but a man with very extensive experience in both the civilian and professional gaming worlds. James Dunnigan is my favorite game designer. He designed over 150 war games, and he founded Stimulations Publications Incorporated, the first really large and prolific war game publisher. He wrote long ago in his Complete War Games Handbook that there were 2 rules of game design that controlled all the others. First, as you can see, keep it simple. Second, almost as important, plagiarize, or if you prefer the euphemism, use available techniques. It is very, very difficult to keep a game design simple. no matter which community you're designing for, and plagiarizing or using available proto techniques or code, if you prefer, is one of the best ways to keep your work on track. There's very little, I think, that's genuinely new under the sun when it comes to game design. But what's out there already is there to be adopted and to be judiciously used by you where appropriate to keep your design comprehensible and flowing. These techniques have already been subject to testing, criticism, scrutiny, and yes, abuse by a committee and a community much larger than the one you might be reporting. Just remember, please acknowledge your intellectual debts. So all, I think, is far from lost when we consider the very broad range of techniques and practices that are adaptable to professional use. When I look through the collections of contemporary topic microgames that are put out by the GUWS students, and I read their designer's notes, I see what some of them have done. For example, in the recent Indo-Python collection that was distributed this spring, there's a game called Mindanao Meyer by Nick Werner, whose design was informed by the coin system games published by G&G. Good place to start, good place to take it. So I'm largely done complaining now, except to reiterate what I said in my Mad Scientist blog entry about several aspects of the current operational environment for large-scale combat operations that were listed in the trade-off document, and add a few more. Yes, commercial games cover these poorly, if they treat them at all, but I will offer or suggest some notable exceptions or possibilities that occur to me and illustrate here where they have informed games for professional audiences. So I'm hoping that my suggestions here might give you some further ideas and places where to look. So the aspects I'm thinking about are planning and coordination across domains. This shades off into use of time and space, control, and correlation of action in multiple domains. Limited intelligence and deception, or more broadly, all of ISR, as it shows up in the condition of this apparently transparent battlefield. Logistics, boy, does this one get the handbrake up, from supply of munitions to simple sustainment in the field. Information warfare, and more broadly, psychological warfare generally, and the will to fight that we were talking about this morning. And finally, civilians. Andrew Olson gave a fantastic introduction to this topic. I would like to speak a little bit more about it, but Andrew mainly is the subject matter expert here. Unless your game is situated in deep space or the bottom of the ocean, a war game needs to give insight into human terrain that it's played on top of. This can be the most complex condition of all, and I will have more to say about that. In fairness, though, I want to add that there are some conditions of the operational environment that civilian games do seem to handle in a backhanded way via their abstractions and limitations. In no particular order, I would offer the transparent battlefield, the godlike omnipotence of vision and knowledge that's enjoyed by players of most civilian war games has always been one of its greatest flaws and detractors of any claim it might ever have to realism. But in a potentially perfectly transparent battlefield, with the ubiquitous sensors, unmanned reconnaissance systems, surveillance from space, blue force trackers, so forth, life may finally have imitated art. Increased lethality. Most civilian war games have very relatively clean and quick combat results tables processes and resolutions that neatly divide results into categories of movement, partial damage, or complete annihilation. So with a throw of 1 or 2 dice, dozens, if not hundreds, of small engagements are abstractly resolved. Maneuver units and combat systems sustain damage and decisive disintegration at rates far faster than reality. The maxim, what is seen is also soon dead again, suggests that life imitates art. And weapons of mass destruction. In many civilian war games over the years, nuclear weapons are chucked around on the tabletop fairly casually. This practice goes all the way back to Charles Roberts and his original tactics war game, produced in the 50s, at a time when the regular army and its planners tended to think of atomic weapons as equivalent to unusually powerful and concentrated masses of high explosives. One particular contemporary designer's trademark, is row after row of mushroom cloud markers on his cover sheets. Although in the game, their effects are transitory, clean, and without serious consequences. So, planning and coordination. I've illustrated a few examples here. Gulf Strike, Flashpoint series, and the Next War systems all combine action in multiple domains, but they don't have an explicit planning or synchronization phase. Obviously, if you're playing one of these games, it is much, much better if you have a plan and you can understand the game well enough in order to coordinate your action across these multiple domains. But it's not made an explicit part of the experience. There are other games where there is a point where it is part of the actual mechanic of the game. One of these is a game I designed called the Quick Urban Integrated Combat Kriegspiel. This is a game that I came up with a year or two ago for the California National Guard Urban Operations Plan, of course. So it's operational combat, listed in large cities. The beginning of the turn is an explicit planning phase where the players, in a rather high level sense, sequence the battle that they intend to fight. There are also other sync map or program systems that you could think of. There's an interesting game that came out several years ago called Fog of War, designed by Jeff Engelstein. In this game, both sides simultaneously and secretly make choices for what they're going to do during the turn, and they place cards representing forces and maneuvers on the map. And then they set the sequence and type of their anticipated actions. So here's another example of where planning is made an explicit and separate phase at the top of the turn. So it becomes, for a moment anyway, top of mind for the players, who I think do sometimes need to get this kind of reinforcement. There's also card-driven methods. Knights of Fire is a game that I worked on a few years ago on the Battle of Budapest in 1956. Soviet player, in going through their turn, selects from a number of cards that are like little tactical scripts that give him some options. And so in a sense, they have to build out their turn with minimal flexibility, what they're going to be able to do. There's also other games that rely on different classifications of staff activity, and players will play through their turn trying to hand the cards that are selected for different types of staff activity. This staff card system was invented by Joe Miranda years ago in a work in a game called Folge 20. I've used it in a couple of games myself since, especially one on the Third Lebanon War. So some of these games have certainly influenced professional war games. The operational war game system, okay, by Colonel Barrett, is the initial concept, as I understood it, was to adapt and blend the Next War series and Compass Games South China Sea. But as you've all seen and probably personally experienced, what came out was a very different kind of hybrid. In doing some research, I found a 2021 monograph done for SAMS by an Army major that proposed an Army all-domain operations game called Theatrum Belli. Operational games that he cited for research and influence included Gulf Strike, the Next War system, and the operational war game system, which his ADO game does resemble. Intelligence. Some useful points can emerge through limited intelligence and deception games through the very design of the components themselves. Block games, mainly wooden blocks, the use of maps and player aids. Some interesting block games that use this effectively are strategic scale block games like Europe and Gulf. We Are Coming Nineveh, which is a recent operational scale game on the Battle of Mosul in 2017, and Strike of the Eagle, which is about the Russo-Polish War. Again, with Fog of War by Jeff Engelstein, it uses a little dial mechanism that hides what is going to happen until it actually happens, which is another interesting use of limited intelligence. Games can also be single blind or double blind. In fact, almost any war game can be adopted to play this way, but it takes a lot of time and attention to play. Two older examples that are really notable in this application are City Fight. This is an old SPI game on double blind tactical urban combat, and NATO Division Commander, which is meant to be an operational scale game that is meant to be played double blind. Both of these are from a long time ago, but they've been rarely imitated since. Strike of the Eagle, again, first an example of a double blind game that's perhaps easier to obtain. Games on deception that also rely on players accumulating or deducting small pieces of information to be put together to assemble the entire intelligence picture. There's a recent game called Operation Barclay, which uses a card mechanic similar to poker to gain evidence tokens about Allied movements in the Mediterranean. Bodyguard Overlord is an old, overlooked, but good John Kratos design on deduction and accumulation of information to discover or obscure the Allied invasion site in France in 1944. I'm not personally aware of many examples of games, professional games, that investigate deception specifically. But at this year's Connection UK conference, I did see 3 products from Project Wire, which is a group working on intelligence training or training of intelligence officers and analysts at the UK Ministry of Defence. They showed 3 games: Deception Detectives, 100 Battles, and Decepticards. These use the mechanics of card games to teach principles of military deception. Logistics, training games, I think, are a good genre. Training games, not my stuff, okay? But there's an entire genre of games about setting up training networks that are devoted to efficient route planning and movement of goods. And this swaps over into games like Power Fit. 1944, Race to the Rhine, is something that's often been used in classes at our service colleges. It's a good example of a semi-cooperative game that focuses on the spoke and node model of logistics and throughput of supplies. Supply Lines of the American Revolution is a very simple looking, but not simple playing game that has been used as often appeared at game nights at Staff College or the War Colleges, which is what I've heard. And finally, I present 2 examples of logistics maybe gone a little bit overboard in terms of process. One is the feared and often cited, but almost never played, campaign for North Africa. And Logistics Command, which is an interesting example of something produced by Westinghouse Corporation of all people back in 1978, just to show that it can be done, but just not always all that well. So some professional games that have been influenced by these types of games include a game I designed a little while ago called 91 DSSB about life in a fictional sustainment battalion. It's a 3-player cooperative game about life in the hellish treadmill that is a sustainment battalion, or so I imagine it. Anyway, but the mechanics for the game I stole from Red November. I don't know if anybody knows about that game, but it's a strange little game that appeared years ago about gnomes running around on an atomic submarine trying to fix it. And the mechanics from that game, it sounds crazy. The mechanics from that game actually informed my working through this particular game about the sustainment. So again, you can find inspiration in the strangest places. Another professional game that's been influenced by these games that I've given as examples is Thor's Hammer. This is about operational logistics in Norway. This one was made by Georgetown University students for the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. The designers mentioned playing Race to the Rhine a lot as an inspiration. There's a Major Catherine Dieter who just graduated from the Command and General Staff College with her MMS degree. She won an award for her thesis, which included a logistics game called Lines and Webs of different methods of setting up a logistics network and the advantages and disadvantages of each. And in her literature review, Major Dieter cited Thor's Hammer, Race to the Rhine, and MadSci, which is a coin, or it's a game of medieval warfare, medieval logistics in her literature review. Information warfare, and more broadly, again, psychological warfare and the notion of the will to fight. This is something you find a lot in insurgency games. And again, this is where a large part of my work it has lied. Insurgency games often have a psychological warfare angle. And it can also cross over into, let's call them, sort of multi-premise games. 10 years ago, I designed a game on the Crimean crisis back in 2014 that relied partly on dominance in the information domain, which fed into the game currency of what I call prestige, which in the original version of the game, I tried to relate to a Seinfeld episode where George talks about having pan in a relationship. So I think to this day, I did delete it later, but for a while, it was, I think, the only board game ever to have a Seinfeld reference in it. So there are some other games about creating and delivering competitive narratives. Lizards and Lies is a recent game about identifying and defeating misinformation by a Canadian scholar. Align by our own Sebastian Bay. Doubt is our product, which is a very thoughtful game that appeared recently about fighting disinformation put out by the tobacco industry over the years. This is a very interesting take on the subject, and it's put out by a small press outfit called Hollandspiel. but you can obtain copies. I think there's some very interesting insights in here about both about promulgating misinformation and about fighting misinformation. And I offer also Splendor, which seems unusual, a game about Renaissance merchants dueling for prestige and privileges. But this game, Splendor, I saw was the inspiration for a game that I saw by a half professional designer at Connections UK called Winning Them Over. This was a game that he had designed about players competing to build more and more complex narratives to better and better targeted audiences for their information, which was based on Splendor. I think there's some interesting, assonances between the two when you think about it. I mentioned Project Wire, this group from the UK Ministry of Defence. They have a game that they brought out, debuted at last year's Connections UK conference called Powers of Persuasion. This is a card game that uses the mechanics of rumming, set collection, and card drafting. And it's used to model campaigns of influence and again, information campaigns. More broadly, I think traditional card games can help us with some really good mechanics. People have often cited poker as one of the best of these because poker, of course, is an intensely psychological game. If I knew more about bridge, I would probably mention bridge too, but I don't. And if nothing else, just simply using a deck of ordinary playing cards furnish some great ready-made components and ready-made mechanics. I've designed 8 war games that use one or more decks of ordinary playing cards in one way or another. I brought 2 of them with me for game night if anyone's curious to talk to me about those. I also want to mention the UK Ministry of Defence one more time. Recently, they put out an Influence Wargaming handbook that has at the back a set of case studies about particular war games, and it involves a description and evaluation of malign selections, along with some others. Civilians. I want to talk about this at some length. About 10 years ago, the military doctrine of the United States, and by extension, and later other NATO members, began to shift away from prioritizing civilian protection and support as a key center of gravity for victory. Instead, it tilted towards limiting harm to civilians as a utilitarian, legal, and moral consideration that was incidental to destroying the enemy's forces in kinetic operations. These kinetic operations are going to be chaotic, highly destructive, and for the most part, located in densely populated urban areas. We cannot let civilian or professional game designers off easily in continuing to fail to research or model civilian populations in these settings. There is a large amount of research and literature out there on how civilians are affected by conflict. In my view, that research is not well connected to other pieces of research, and it has not been usefully employed to inform games or models. I may be arguing from a position of total ignorance, but that's how I see it. These games, I think, would have tremendous potential worth and potential influence that could inform estimates of civilian casualties, to appropriate force structures, tactics, TTPs, deal with civilians, the useful studies of patterns of civilian behavior in aid or in spite of accomplishing missions. As Amber pointed out this morning, where civilians appear in war games at all, most often they're portrayed like a non-player character from a role-playing game. A common method of treatment is to simply have civilians pop up more or less randomly during the game in response to chit goals or random events derived from a table. The civilians that are, when they appear, are also almost completely without agency, and normally they're of only little value in accomplishing the aims of the game. There are, of course, exceptions where civilians do have some more agency and autonomy, but you often find these in games where it's a civilian enemy versus authority. So Civil Power, Battle of Seattle, and Block by Block Insurrection are all examples of more or less tactical scale games where you have civilians against some form of authority, not always volunteer. At the operational level, you have wider aspects of phases, population, numbers, and time. For Zermatt, which is a recent game that came out about Afghanistan that revolves around creating and keeping civilian support in a district, I created a variant of that game that introduces a third player to the game, a player who takes the role of the civilian population being fought over, and whose objective is to disengage from and, as far as possible, frustrate the actions of both the Taliban and the coalition players. The District Commander series of counterinsurgency games, these are operational level counterinsurgency games, include notions of terror, depopulation, and automated criminal and non-state militia elements prey on the civilian population. I earlier mentioned We Are Coming Nineveh. That's a game on the Battle of Mosul. Uses the idea of overall accumulated collateral damage to the civilians and infrastructure of the city as an important metric for ultimate victory or loss. There are also examples of recent board games for professional audiences that examine large-scale combat operations in cities. I mentioned the Quick game, or Quick Urban Integrated Combat Kriegspiel. In it, you have multiple civilian markers who appear on the map as infrastructure and units are destroyed, and then become a matter of greater and greater concern to the players as they start to interfere with combat operations. This aspect wasn't as detailed in the game as I wanted it to be. However, the objective of designing the game was to put something together that officers could learn and play very quickly. So I had a bit of a limitation there. Earlier this morning, Sebastian mentioned 2 games on civilian harm mitigation reduction that were done by Georgetown University Wargaming Society, Chimmer, and Violent Victory. Both present players with dilemmas and choices on how to mitigate harm to civilian populations while retaining combat effectiveness. There are also games that are used by both professional and civilian players that deal with humanitarian action and disaster response or crisis situations. Aftershock was cited this morning. There are other games on the same general topic of crisis response, resilience, designed by a person who works in the French Ministry of Defense. Blackout and Neustadt are 2 other games that deal with disasters. 2 other notable games portray the non-combatant evacuation operation, which is almost never done in any set of games. Spider's Thread, Sebastian mentioned that as one of these Indo-PACOM microgames, covering evacuations of non-combatants from small islands. Escape from Kabul is an interesting adaptation of Aftershock that covers the coalition withdrawal from Kabul in 2021. Well, I've spoken at length about civilian issues because, as I've noted, civilian harm reduction and mitigation is a DoD priority. However, I also note that it's not only a neglected aspect of gaming the operational environment in civilian games, it's also a neglected topic in the trade-off G2 document that we've been discussing that describes the environment itself and is the background for our conference today. The words civilian, population, and non-combatant appear only once or twice each in the document, and all of them appear on page 21 of the dense urban warfare condition. Each time these words are used, they refer to constraints, constraints on maneuver, constraints on effective artillery fire. There's even a suggestion on page 21 that the United States may create conditions that force battles out of urban areas to conduct effective LISCO. So sidestepping this complete issue, and I have no idea on earth how we could do that. But here's what I think. We will not be conducting LISCO on a moon. Understanding the local population's history, needs, and attitudes toward friendly and enemy forces is part of the commander's operational planning process and needs to be part of the preparation of the game. Therefore, war games, civilian and professional, need to give some insight into the human terrain that the game is played on top of. And again, Andrew this morning gave you an excellent introduction. If you didn't happen to be here this morning, please go and read Andrew's contribution to the Mad Scientist blog. It appeared on August 15th. Where he talks about civilian harm mitigation response and how it should be reflected in wargaming. Stellar stuff. Still, I think that there are some standards to aim for in games that involve civilians. The game should assign 1 or more civilian roles to 1 or more distinct, inventive, and especially adversarial and obstinate human players, as opposed to a die roll or a chip roll. These games, civilian role players should be actual role players too, as much as possible. Attitudes, motivations, game abilities, and win conditions that are informed by research and information that are particular to the situation. Again, one size is not going to fit all. The game should also be semi-cooperative. Just as it should be possible for any player in the game to win, it should also be possible for all players to lose. Remembering this will inform the military players' behaviors while pursuing their particular win conditions, while balancing it with their responsibility to understand, protect, and sometimes, yes, exploit use of the non-combatant population. And finally, like all good games, the game should generate a believable and insightful narrative with respect to the civilians acting in the game. Because we keep reminding ourselves in the game, these games are far more about understanding people and ideas and decisions than they are about generating technical knowledge or mechanical solutions. Otherwise, we'll continue to fool ourselves with the best path answers, or at worst, some nasty surprises and debacle. So thank you for your attention. Here's some links where you can get the scriptly slides for this presentation and browse through some collections of relevant and free microgames by our colleagues. Questions? Okay, so any questions? Maybe I'll leave up with a question. Those of you who design war games, what's the craziest civilian-derived mechanic you found useful in designing or playing a serious game? I mentioned my experience with gnomes on a submarine. So has anyone else found a crazy source of inspiration? Maybe something.
Figure it out in microphone. You have to turn one off, turn the other one off.
Okay, yes.
So we'll let them ask the question, or we can just turn the other one.
I turn this back on to answer?
Yes. Yeah, we only have one on at a time.
Yes, Mehmet Kınacı from Light Command Transformation. You started with your presentation that the nature of warfare is changing. What evidence to support that? The second question is how you see the aspects of future operating environment is going to be reflected, or how you reflect this in a war game. You know, you have it like in the left-hand side, like the U.S. Army's large-scale combat operations. They look at 2034. How are we going to get all these aspects into a war game, like the technology aspects, how AI is going to be used, how space is going to be used, how EW is going to be used, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your supplemental. That's a really deep question, and it's also very broad. If I were to give a short answer to this, I would say that there is not going to be any one war game that's going to reflect all of these at the same time at an appropriate level of detail and consequence. There is no one size fits all. There is no one system to rule them all, and I don't think there ever will be, and I don't think there should be. We're going to have to pick and choose in the games that we're going to design and play. When you sit down to design a game, the first thing you ask yourself is, what is this thing going to be about? And you want your game to make 1 or 2 or possibly 3 points. You can't try to make a game make 12 or 15 points all at the same time. You're going to end up with something that's unplayable. So there will be games coming out on all different aspects that incorporate different conditions here. But I don't think you're ever going to have one that reflects on anything. All of these games will be able to, or should be able to, acknowledge many of these conditions. But the designer is going to have to set some priorities. He's going to have to figure out what gets more abstraction, more simplification. Let's not just say just a hand wave, okay, but to acknowledge, of course, the limitations of the game themselves and limitations of themselves as a designer. So maybe that's perhaps an evasive answer. I hope it isn't, but I just do not think that there's something that will be able to cover absolutely everything. You're going to have to pick and choose, but you're going to have to pick and choose correctly. And who's going to judge that?
We have time for one more quick question.
Thank you for presentation. Captain Fan from National Guard Bureau's Mobilization Officer. So I really like the slide when you talk about time and planning, synchronization. So my particular question is focused about with the Army preparation for political and multi-domain warfare. So one of the essential factors is the centralized command controls. What's the good example with the war game that you as a war gaming creators? How could we simulate that condition in a war game where the decision-making process is centralized?
Okay, it's on now. Thank you. There are the question of command and control and different echelons of command and control is something that, in my view, the better sort of war game tries to look at. You can in your standard civilian war game, the players have godlike omnipotence, godlike power. They have only to stretch out a finger and a BCT appears there. That's great, but that's not real. I think that we need to have games that reflect as much as possible the inherent friction in any command and control system, whether it's centralized or decentralized. Both have their advantages, both have their disadvantages. We need to have games that acknowledge how things screw up and what to do about it. Again, not commercially saleable, not an awful lot of fun. But I was here for fun. People here. Good people.
You leave that.
Good, thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Train.